Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Shea, and Erika Schiller as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership.
Hello, and welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Erika Schiller, and today I have with me Nathalie Flores. Nathalie is the Vice Chair of the Science and Technology Body of UN Climate Change. Nathalie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share with the private sector, the US, the podcast, and what we are doing at the global level to actually have decisions to address climate change.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we'd love to hear your role. What is the Vice Chair of the Science and Technology Body? And what do you think the biggest challenges are that you're trying to address, either in your particular body, and also like what is COP trying to address? So we'd like to understand this. There's a lot of discussion about international negotiations and COP, but what are those big challenges you're trying to solve there?
Well, I think it's really important to understand first the process. And I'm very glad that you bring that up, because sometimes people listen, Conference of the Parties, COPs, and everybody is usually very attracted to the fact that there's a COP, but it's more than, let's say, the parade kind of thing. I like to give context on the fact that the three Rio Conventions, which are the Desertification Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and the UN Climate Change, all of them have Conference of the Parties. Mm. The Conference of the Parties is the biggest body of each convention, and it hosts the ministers of these countries, right, represented to make the decisions in each convention. Okay. And at the same time, each convention has a body for science and technology and a body for implementation. So it's the same with the three treaties that came from the Rio Convention. Now, with the UN climate change specifically, we have, let's say, a different approach in terms of timing. Why is that? Because we meet twice a year, meaning that we have 2 rounds of negotiations. And the other 2 conventions, the desertification and the biodiversity, only meet every 2 years. Mm. So this Conference of the Parties come, let's say, under the mandate that the country give to the secretariat of each of this convention, and the need to address a decision faster or not. And that's why the UN climate change meets twice a year. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, if the parties ask by more time to finish a work in a year, and by work I mean a negotiation work, the countries can give mandate to the convention to actually host extraordinary negotiations. Okay. So
has that happened before?
Yes. When I was a junior, delegate for my country, I'm originally from the Dominican Republic, as you know. And when I was a junior, I remember attending an extraordinary negotiation process after Bonn and before COP to actually advance decisions. Mm-hmm. One, I remember it was in April in Thailand, because there is an Asia Pacific Conference Center for the UN over there, and it's super big and can host all of us. And the other one was like 2 years after that in Panama. So, it all depends on the party's mandate. It's really important to understand about the process that the UN Climate Change Secretariat or any other of these secretariats only act upon mandates from the parties, meaning the countries. So the Climate Change Convention actually needs a global decision to perform any duty that they perform for the countries. Mm. So they need a decision that says, okay, you're going to host an extraordinary negotiations. You are going to host a web page. You are going to host climate weeks. Mm. Everything needs to come from a country decision. Mm. And that's why, if you have seen like all the things that I try to raise awareness in LinkedIn or any other social media platform since I got this role, I've been very passionate of letting people know how the process works. And in these events, I usually talk about the United Nations in general, the whole system is literally a club of governments. So each government pays a fee to actually be part of the convention. That means us, taxpayer money, but because even if you work for the government or not, you pay taxes.
Of course.
And your, I don't know, let's say in the US, the State Department dedicate a budget to actually be part of the convention and be, in the process, as my country does too. And that's interesting to mention, even though, maybe goes a little round in the conversation. But the thing is that sometimes people ask themselves, like, why this country or the other country is a COP president? They pay the fee.
Okay.
They are part of the convention. The presidency rotates in different geopolitical spaces. So rotates from Europe to Eastern Europe to the Middle East to Africa to Latin America to Asia Pacific. And in this rotation, you have to volunteer to actually be a president of a COP.
Okay.
Then if all parties decide and give mandate that you are going to be the president of the COP, then you become president of the COP, but you need to be from that region. And of course, you need to be part of the convention. And then the 195 parties decide a COP is going to be over there. But I think the most important thing to highlight is the fact that each country, part of the convention, has the right to volunteer themselves to host a COP. And, it's very controversial that we have COP 27, COP 28, and COP 29 in states that some people recognize as petrostates or things like that, but actually they're part of the convention. And turns out that even when they are that, Egypt is Africa. So it was the African turn. And then the African group came with the voluntary role that Egypt decided to put forward to become president of the COP. Then the Middle East, it was the turn for UAE, and they volunteered to do that. And everybody decides, okay, if you volunteer with all the duties that came with volunteering to host the COP, then you can do it. And now it's Eastern Europe. So that's why it's in Azerbaijan. So that's the trend of how a president of the COP is decided. And then after that, you have the technical negotiations, because we cannot get lost on the fact that it's a big gathering.
Yes.
That the parties, because it's the countries that make the decision, and I'm going to be repeating that for a while, because the parties decided to create an enabling environment to bring all stakeholders to the table.
Okay.
So first, the NGOs, some of the NGOs are observers to the convention.
And that's non-governmental organizations.
That's non-governmental, but non-governmental organizations can accreditate themselves as observers of the process.
Okay.
And they are that's a process that takes about a year in the UN climate change. So if you have the condition to become an observer to the process, you can actually do it. Not a badge, but actually an official observer to what the convention is supposed to deliver. And then the private sector. And that's where, the pavilions comes in, because we are invited to talk in events. But in parallel, you have negotiators from 194 parties to the convention, trying to get text on a specific decision that we want to achieve in each conference of the parties.
So if you're an observer or you're a private sector company, it doesn't mean you're silent. It just means that you are not a voting party. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, if you are as a non-governmental organization, you are observer to the convention, there's a space in which observer can actually talk.
Okay.
For example, these observers organizations that can be NGOs, academias, or any other category that fits into the observer definition that it's in the UN Climate Change Convention, you have spaces that are designed for you to, take part. Even in plenaries, like the chair of each body gives the voice to the observer to actually come with statements on certain topics. And that's where the role of being an official observer plays. Now, if you get a badge for a specific, negotiation and you're observer, probably you cannot talk as raising a flag because you're not an official observer. And the official observer have a specific spaces for them to make their statements.
Okay.
Yes.
So we had COP28 in Dubai, as you mentioned, and there are still outstanding items that haven't been resolved related to Article 6 from the Paris Agreement. And just before we started recording, you were reflecting that, Article 6 was signed in the Paris Agreement in 2015, right? So almost 10 years ago. And there are still outstanding items, right? Things that aren't resolved or clarified and written down and decided, right, on paper. So what should we be looking for in terms of signals or outcomes coming out of the Azerbaijan or the Baku COP later this year?
I think it's important to come back a little bit to the process. So as we were just reflecting, the Paris Agreement was adopted and then ratified by countries in 2015. And in record time, it's the treaty that was ratified by countries in the fastest path, right? Because we adopted it in 2015 in December, and then in September by the UN General Assembly that we actually have next week in New York, countries were already ratifying the Paris Agreement, correct? And the Paris Agreement has an article that it's Article 6, and everybody is very keen to Article 6 because it's the transformation of the former Clean Development Mechanism, as we know it, to have a global definition, global framework for market and non-market approaches in terms of mitigation actions.
Reducing emissions.
Exactly. Because it's good that you bring that up, because when I talk about this, I always also refer to the fact that the convention has an ultimate goal, which is reducing carbon emissions. But then we've been trying, and by we, I mean the parties, have been trying to come to an agreement on how they are going to reduce those emissions through market, deploy funding, and helping the most vulnerable countries, first to adapt, second to, mitigate if they are emitting, but also will help the developed country itself to reduce their emissions. And it's very interesting that the private sector, while countries are trying to agree on how that is going to work, right? The private sector has been working on voluntary basis on reducing their emissions through ESG, through the voluntary carbon market, and other approaches, while we are in the negotiations table for about 10 years, trying to decide how we are going to have a global framework for that. So kudos to the private sector for the governments, and in the timing, we don't have the time to actually lose 10 more years on this.
And just on that, earlier in a prior podcast that we just recorded was around RED projects, private sector RED projects, so avoided deforestation or, planned or unplanned, and jurisdictional RED, and how, the concept of RED was created, but because the process of creating jurisdictional or country level regulated programs is long, right?
Yeah.
The private sector's kind of stepped in first.
Yeah, but I don't want to talk too much about RED because I can get very passionate about that topic, and then we won't finish ever.
Okay.
And I was RED Plus negotiator for many years when I was junior. In our delegations, usually you rotate the topics depending on your expertise. But I think it's important to understand that it's a legal text what you are trying to put together, when you are trying to decide. So that's why I'm a lawyer first, and then an environmentalist / I have my master's on environmental issues, but that came along the way. And of course, diplomacy. But my point is that the RED Plus package is ready since 2013. So in COP19, the global framework decided RED Plus. And we have the decisions over there
Mm-hmm.
The rules for the global framework, it's ready. It's called the Warsaw Framework. And that's what the UN has, right? And then whatever comes from that global framework, usually it's under the national circumstances of each country. And the rules that based on that framework, after the ratification of any decision that a country goes through, then each country creates the rules that they need to actually put forward the global framework. In case of the Dominican Republic, just to give an example, and the Dominican Republic is implementing RED Plus through the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank. And it's the only ERPA, which is an agreement of emission reduction and transfer in between the Dominican Republic and the World Bank for RED Plus. And that's a national framework. So it's not jurisdictional. And it's, an agreement that it's over there. It's everybody can read it in the webpage of the government of the Dominican Republic and the World Bank. And you can see all, how the transactions are done, how the benefits are distributed, how the agreements with the communities are put together, how the agreements with the private sector, because in the case of the Dominican forest, the main goal is to protect our watershed. That's our context.
Mm-hmm.
And then also to abate the edges of the protected areas from agriculture. So the Dominican Republic decided that they wanted to work with agricultures to protect the edges of the protected areas of the country, and then give them compensation for implementing agriculture that is climate friendly. Just to give you an example.
Sure. And I guess building on that, you were saying that the framework that comes out of a COP or any of these negotiated parties is a framework that then each country decides how they're going to adopt it. So when we have a nationally determined contribution, each country decides, this is my target, my NDC of how many emissions I'm going to have at this future year, or how much I'm going to reduce my current emissions profile. And so how do those fit into COP, and how are those NDCs or the nationally determined contributions implemented?
Well, the national determined contributions are a decision from, the previous to the Paris Agreement. It was called the intent national determined contribution. And then with the Paris Agreement, it's called national determined contribution.
Okay.
It's your decarbonization plan.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference in between the convention and the Paris Agreement is that the convention as a treaty establishes the common but differentiated circumstances of each party. So you have the non-Annex 1 parties and the Annex 1 parties, developed countries, developing countries. You have that divided in the convention because the convention, when it was adopted back in 1992, the convention established that these developed parties were the one emitting carbon.
Yes.
And they should help the countries suffering from this contamination, correct?
Mm-hmm.
To put it in more...
Sure, they have a different role, different...
Exactly. But the Paris Agreement actually gives everyone the same commitment, which means all parties need to have a decarbonization plan with clear targets. And that's where the national determined contributions comes in. It's a strategy that you present to the convention on voluntary basis. What is voluntary on this is your target, but you are committed to actually have a decarbonization plan because you signed the Paris Agreement. So you have to do it. And again, since the convention already have the common but differentiated thing, right, established, then everybody needs to do it under their national circumstances.
Okay.
For example, when I had the honor to serve as climate change director in the government of the Dominican Republic, and I will keep using that example because that's the only I have, correct? We put together a whole machinery to actually do our national determined contribution with the private sector, with the youth, with the academia, with all type of producers that you can imagine that actually contribute to our emissions, even if our emissions are super small. And then we put a plan that they could meet, right? And we calculated how much we had to invest, what are the low hanging fruits for us to actually be able to decarbonize our country in a target. But another thing that helped the Dominican Republic a lot is that in 2012 we put together, and by then I was a full servant of the Dominican government, we put together a law that is our national strategy for development, and the Congress approved 3 quotas of emissions reductions. So let's say one from one year to the other one from the year to the other. So that is established by law in the Dominican Republic, which means that an NDC backed by such a legal framework, it's stronger.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
Because we actually have a national framework that says that we have to reduce carbon emissions in certain years. And there are more ambitious countries that have, no matter if they are developed or not, but that have very ambitious decarbonization programs. And that is also based on their priorities / national circumstances. Perhaps a country that has a lot of forest, they can leverage their decarbonization by forest. Or for example, you have Panama, that Panama is a carbon negative country because of what their forest captures. So each country presents based on their national circumstances what is their decarbonization plan to the Paris Agreement. That's a commitment of 5 years as the agreement established. And then now countries are working on the 3rd version of their NDCs for 5 more years.
Okay.
And each year, the call of the parties, because at the end is the process for the parties, is to be more ambitious based on what they achieve in meeting their NDCs. So I think NDCs as a decarbonization plan is interesting, but personally, and this is Nathalie Flores, this is beyond the role. I think the national frameworks that can, build and at the same time protect the decarbonization plan itself with laws or establishing clear rules on how they are going to achieve that, then are going to be the stronger one. And this is probably not fitting the NDC itself, because the NDCs in case of the United States are, it's federal. But I always like to highlight and congratulate the role of the state of California in actually being the, most advanced in terms of keep their development with, all the good and bad things that can happen as a state, correct? But reduce their emissions with the tools that California has put in place. And if you account that in your country's NDC, depending on the rules, because of course, there we go again to the national circumstances. The federal government is the one that reports the NDC to the convention. This is my decarbonization plan. But then it also builds on how it's going to be deployed to achieve that through their national circumstances. In this case, let's say state level.
Yeah.
But I wanted to give the example because it's a state that keeps developing as economic development, because at the end, we want to protect nature because we need nature. We cannot live without nature on Earth. We want to leverage the investment that we do in nature protection, and we want to secure that vulnerable citizens live better, correct? Through a global framework.
Yeah.
But it's an economic transformation. And sometimes I feel we are so close to get over there and so far. And then comes examples like California, when you actually read the numbers of your cap and trade programs, your, clean air, clean air policies. And, I'm not going to get too deep into that because it's just an example. And there are other examples around the world like that. But I wanted to give that as example because for Latin America, since we are so close to the US, it's interesting to have something tangible like that and see it, and see, okay, this is actually achievable.
Yeah.
Like, since we haven't emit that much, it is important still to see that you can actually reduce carbon emissions and keep your development, as the example of California. So let's say that I haven't read too deep into the US NDC, to be honest. But let's say with the global framework and the national circumstances, then the US reports on how they are achieving their NDC with these examples around the whole country.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah, and we had the state of Indiana come and talk about their climate action plan and how the EPA, so the federal level, was paying for the states to develop a climate action plan to help them understand what are the needs and the priorities of the specific state and those communities within the state to really tailor the carbon, reduction plans and the also economic development of a clean economy to really serve the needs and the priorities of that community. So it's nice to see beyond California that there are a lot of other states, almost all 50 states, but not quite, applied for funding from the EPA to develop a climate action plan to really go on the ground and say, we see this high level UN goal and our country has a nationally determined contribution of their goals and their plans to reduce, but here's how we're going to implement it in our state, and here's what makes sense for our community.
Yeah, and that's the way forward. And as I told you, each country performs on their national scheme, and that's important to understand. But I think matching with that is understanding that at the end, the UN is not just a system. It's just something that was put together for all countries to have a common goal. And it's not the UN as an organization or as a secretariat. And not only, there are a lot of UN agencies, but the point is that it's an enabled environment for countries to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And that's where the global framework plays a role. And as such a big country as the US, as other federal governments like Mexico, like Brazil, that also is federal. Argentina is not, but each province is autonomous, which means it's kind of federal as well. So, they have to put these rules into place to actually come to the implementation of the global framework. And that's why every time people talk about, oh, this COP was a failure or was not, I like to give them the scope of the fact of how huge this is. We have a body for science and technology. We have a body for implementation. We have the conference of the parties. We have the parties meeting as the parties agreement, which is the minister in another body within the convention, correct? Trying to make decisions on different agenda items. First, in the science and technology body, me and the chair, we moderate the process to have technical decisions. And after parties finish those technical decisions, then we need funding for that. And that's where the contribution of the emitters comes in to the deployment of technology transfer, capacity building in the countries, because developed countries already, achieved their development. And we always talk about finance, but I always put myself in perspective of how are we going to achieve climate finance if we don't bring the private sector in? We are not going to achieve climate finance only with taxpayer money as we are, because the UN climate change, as any other UN agency, works with the contribution of the membership, correct? So what I want to say is that this framework and then the national framework that comes from all these bodies that each environmental convention or UN convention has is to regulate the private sector, but in a way that it's of use to the global framework. And it's because climate change, as other environmental issues, affect all. It's not only a matter of here or there. Yeah. It's over there. It's going to affect all. Something that something that I like to mention. It's a problem that we have in the Caribbean. It's sargassum. So even though this is not a negotiation topic in the UN climate change, because as I said, first we need to do workshops, scientific workshops, and after scientific workshops, it needs to be approved that it's going to be an agenda item. meaning that we are going to negotiate legal text on science, and then we need to deploy funding. But my point is that that's caused by climate change.
And can you explain what is sargassum?
It's the algae that comes up to the surface and then stays by the shore, and it's like a waste, but it emits gas, correct? And that affects marine life, the marine ecosystem, the coastal marine ecosystem, the tourism, and we need to do something with that.
Okay.
Correct. Both from the gases perspective and from the waste perspective and the protection as a nature-based solution. So that comes from Brazil, from agriculture in Brazil, and go to the bottom of the ocean. Then the algae comes up and affect Mexico, Dominican Republic, the Caribbean, and even Africa. So my point is that it's not a Brazilian problem. It's not a Dominican problem. It's a world issue, that comes from the ocean being heated by, the GHG effect of greenhouse gases. And that's where the whole system connected comes in. And that's why when the civil society or the academia calls on ambition and action, and you see them in the conference of the parties in their, element asking for ambition, the ambition comes from the urgency that we actually need to reduce carbon emissions. And of course, since it's an economic transformation, as I'm telling you, someday you feel that you're right there, but the other day it's like we're by far, of what we want to achieve. But it's important to understand that the multilateral process, it's needed. And unless we come together as one, and probably this sounds like a song, but it's reality, we won't be able to achieve anything, because the only way to achieve that economic transformation that will enable us to reduce emissions, be carbon neutral, or even, net zero at that point will come only if we come together as one. Because at the end, if the US is reducing carbon emissions, or perhaps California, Indiana, as we mentioned before, what do you do with that if Dominican Republic, Mexico, Jamaica keeps emitting? Your commitment is achievable. But then how does that fit into the global framework? And that's exactly the role of multilateralism. Sometimes people is like, oh no, because 10 years of negotiations, but we are talking about 194 parties, trying to come to an agreement of something that is going to rule them all in that pathway that I'm telling you. And that happens for desertification, that happens for biodiversity. And of course, this one, since it's a ruling of a very controversial thing, which is energy, we need, we need fuel to do everything we do. So that's why my favorite word comes in, which is diversification. So if we relate in the fact that we have diversification and we can, bring this, as the UAE consensus did, put in text for the first time in 30 years on actually abate coal, diversing for fossil fuels, triple the investment in renewable energy, that was, a huge achievement. We couldn't even agree in between the countries in 30 years, and I have 14 years in the process. We couldn't agree that we will ever accept the world fossil fuel. And it was done by a fuel country. And these are the interesting perspective that when it comes to multilateralism, I like people to understand. Because at the end, we put our representatives over there. We vote, then they appoint other people. And that's where we need to come and tell them, look, I want people really prepared to defend what we need in terms of nature, carbon emissions, and whatever comes their way to actually achieve that. And after I came to the US in 2014 for a program on renewable energy and climate change, and also when I did my summer program at the University of California, it's when I basically understood the role that the private sector of the United States have done to help the states to get, where they are at in terms of fighting, adapting. The other day, I was listening to a podcast about the finance for adaptation technologies. And then I look back and I was like, look, but the US is talking about adaptation technologies now, and we've been fighting with our need for adaptation for years because we are an island. We don't have another option. We don't emit, and we still need, to face this. So it's interesting, when you understand the process and you understand what role you play in the process. And then when it comes to markets, for example, that we are all very passionate to markets, even me, because I was Red Plus negotiator, then I was market and non-market approaches negotiator, and then I helped countries from another role in negotiating that. Markets, I think, are advancing on their own path, and it's because there are a lot of interest over there. And also, I think we need to understand when a topic is of interest of a specific community or a specific business that you are going to regulate, you also have to understand who's playing the part, and your country's priorities. Because if you want, for example, in the Dominican Republic, we live from tourism. So we need to protect our natural resources. You have a tourist that is more conscious on, nature and all these things. But you have another tourist that only want the infrastructure and they don't want to get out of the hotel. So how do I merge both things, making the hotels in the Dominican Republic more clean, or protecting nature, or building more, So you have all these scopes. Imagine seeing all the businesses that actually emit carbon and how you are going to address that. So first, you need to do it with your stakeholders within your country. And that's why when I was climate change director, that's why we actually brought to the table the emitters to help us achieve a very ambitious NDC for our circumstances.
Right.
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is, look, we do hard things, right? And COP is trying to do a really hard thing, getting all the 194 countries and bodies together to address climate change and to make definitive steps forward. But they're not going to be simple, and they're going to be, high level at the top frameworks that are then rolled out into specific countries. And then even within the country, it might be rolled out into the states and the communities. But I'm hearing a lot of optimism about the progress that you're seeing and the commitments that we're making. And I really appreciate you joining us today to talk about this and help us better understand both how it's going, how we can think about it, and what we should be looking out for future COPs and how to stay engaged, what to look for.
Yeah, and I want to take the opportunity to tell your audience not to lose faith in the process, but also to play your part. And by playing your part is like go to your representatives and tell them through process that can be created, like could be a letter and you'd be like, no, nobody is listening to this. But I remember when we were getting ready for COP27, we had in my country a position of the kids of the Dominican Republic. Like schools came together and put together a position to COP, which we brought to the table. And now you can see for the first time, the chair of the subsidiary body for implementation, mandated by the parties, organized the first in-session workshop in Bonn to start discussing, eventually, as an agenda item, the effects of climate change in children and youth.
Cool.
So even when we feel that we don't have a role to play because it's the countries, like the convention has enabled to bring people to the right people to the table. And I was in the Swiss Climate Reporting Forum in May, and it's really interesting that the Swiss government was sued by Algeria because they were not taking enough actions in terms of climate change from the Algeria perspective. But then this private sector that I was engaging with didn't know the process of the convention. And I was like, you have this gathering. You are reporting for ESG, private sector, all the rulings that the government has. Imagine if from the Swiss Climate Reporting Forum, you get a position for a conference of the parties and you hand it over to your representative and you tell them, look, we are the Swiss Climate Reporting Forum. These are, 100 enterprises in Switzerland that are actually meeting all the ruling for ESG for the private sector. And we want to give you like what works for us and what we got out of what we are discussing over here, if that makes sense. So that applies to everything that the convention has been enabling to create a more inclusive process. We are ahead of a Climate Week in New York City, in which I think it's something that is becoming bigger than an actual conference of the parties. But then that's something key to that is the private sector trying to deploy climate action.
Yeah.
And those are the things we need to look at. And I have to congratulate the Secretary General of the UN when he committed to bring to the General Assembly the presidents, the leaders, the foreign affairs ministers to actually discuss important issues for, security around the globe or any other issue. And climate change is at the forefront because then you have these private sector activities that are happening on the edges of the General Assembly. And you end up having presidents seated with the private sector and telling them, look, I'm willing to actually invest in this economic transformation, but I need you, Mr. President, to engage with me, and your technical people and your directors need to engage with enabling that environment in my national circumstance. And then if you have an enabled environment, for example, me being from a small country, then I'll be able to attract more investment to the country and offer more to a more conscious, product service in the whole process. So at the end, everything is connected, even if we don't see it that way. And that's why I decided to be hopeful. And also I'm talking from what I've seen in the private sector. If I wouldn't see that, I couldn't be talking about that. And also what I've seen when I was in the government, I know our challenges, but also we need to secure something that it's tangible and that goes over time for present and future generations, as much as it sounds like a poem, but it is what it is.
Wow. Thank you so much, Nathalie, and really appreciate your perspectives today and looking forward to seeing what comes out of the next COP and your role there. So thank you so much.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. Subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified of new episodes dropped bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings, and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting www.climeco.com.